Good morning, afternoon, evening. I see at least a couple of people for whom it's the middle of the night. So I am very grateful to have you join us today. My name is Mila Lazarova. I am the William Sewell Professor of International Business at Simon Fraser University, Beatty School of Business. And I am delighted to welcome today Dr. Yvonne Klein that will talk to us about surviving challenging field work without losing your mind and your soul. Before we begin, I want to thank everybody that has been involved in organizing our ongoing, and I'm very pleased to say continuing series of international IHRM webinars. Moving from east to west because we are in several countries. It's Maja Vidovic at RIT Croatia. I'm in Paris. We have Maral Muradbekova and Marian Festing is in Berlin. They're both at campuses of ESCP Business School. In Pennsylvania, we have Elaine Farndale, Cara Arden at Penn State, and Miguel Olivas Uhan at Penn West. And out west, where I am in Vancouver, Gerardo Arteaga and Christine Barnett are my colleagues here at SFU. So from all of us, welcome to our webinar today. So it's a great team of people, and I hope you continue to join us through our series of webinars. But to the presenter, as I said, I'm very pleased to be here with Dr. Klein. Yvonne is an award-winning and highly cited expert on global mobility. She is currently repositioning her research focus to social justice to bring about meaningful and positive change for those experiencing family and domestic violence. Ultimately, Dr. Klein aims to add and guide a high-level Australian government policy and legislative outcomes related to family and domestic violence and coercive control behaviors nationally. And I said research, but she's also quite actively involved in practice as well. Yvonne already has a PhD from Monash University that she got in 2010, but the overachiever and the wonderful human being that she is started a second PhD in social justice at the University of Notre Dame. See, I told you I'll mess this up, Yvonne. Notre Dame, Australia, that just started in January 2023. Dr. Klein's doctoral research examines the criminalization of coercive control behaviors in Australia, with her research goals align closely with her roles as a volunteer researcher for and board member of the Financial Toolbox Women at Risk Trust, which is a non-for-profit that provides support for women facing family and domestic violence. She's has a long commitment to social justice and human rights, and she has served with several groups and committees with human rights focus. Now, you may know Dr. Yvonne Klein from her extensive work on global mobility. She has published well over 100 academic articles, book chapters, and conference presentations on mobility in publications such as the International Journal of Human Resource Management and Journal of World Business. She is the lead author of Working Internationally, Expatriation, Migration, and Other Global Work, and also lead editor of two fantastic volumes on expatriation and expatriate families. And as you see, I'm struggling to read this entire sheet. So Yvonne, thank you so very much for joining us. And I'm very excited to hear about your new area of passion, I'm going to say, that includes both research and practice.
Thank you. Hi, thanks, Mila. Today, what we're going to be looking at is surviving challenging field work. So thanks for joining me today. This is a presentation about you, the academic researcher. It's not about the findings of a study from which I sampled other people and collected data. So what I want to do over the next 45 minutes or so is I want to open up a conversation with you about surviving field work when you're doing it in a challenging or fragile environment with people who may have experienced horrific abuse and trauma and who may still be in states of abject fear, deep-seated anger, and sometimes soul-crushing grief. So this is a presentation about navigating the personal difficulties that researchers face when they're doing arduous field work. So my focus is on you and your emotional and mental health if and when you choose to do such field work. Let me start by saying, though, that to make some of the key points about surviving this type of field work, I'll be sharing with you some deeply disturbing accounts of abuse and trauma that researchers have reported as a result of their own field work. So before we begin, let me provide a trigger warning about some of the content in this presentation. Today, I'll be sharing with you some accounts of explicit sexual violence and violence against children, among other types of abuse and trauma. I'll be using examples from fields such as human rights, which frequently involves witness accounts with people that have endured severe physical and psychological harm that includes extensive dehumanization, death, and prolonged suffering. I'll also be sharing accounts of trauma from expatriates and their families. Now, you might think that these forms of abuse don't apply to the field of international human resource management, but I'm here to suggest to you that it does. And how do I know that? Because I've experienced it myself in my own field work that I've done as a labour mobility scholar in the management field. And I know what you're thinking. How can that be? Isn't management all about multinationals, policies and strategies and firm performance? What does it have to do with the death of children and emotional abuse? Well, I'll get to that shortly. So let's start here. As you read this excerpt from Human Rights Watch, I ask you to consider how these data were obtained. Who did the field work to obtain this particular witness account? And what was the experience like for them? Who wrote this up for the Human Rights Watch report in 2014? And what was it like for them to report this finding? Here's another account taken in 1996 about human rights abuses in Bosnia. And what sort of lasting impact is the reading of this excerpt likely to have on you? If you had taken this witness account in the field, what sort of lasting impact might it have for you and for others? And there's one more thing to consider here. Is it morally right or fair or justified to publish data like this? I would argue that the complex demands of research of this kind that we're seeing here on the screen places extraordinary stress on the researcher, which is likely to elicit powerful emotions. So at a minimum, what it requires is that the researcher remains connected and engaged while they're also unpacking and documenting story after story of survivors' pain, loss, and terror. At best, it is these same difficult conditions that makes research of this type so valuable. It is for you to decide, though, if it's morally right to publish data like this. My view is that if we don't know what's happening in the world, then we cannot equip ourselves to challenge it or to address it or to intervene for the sake of justice. Let me get a bit biographical to show you that shocking abuse also happens among the people that we research in the management field. And as Mila and I and others that are here at this presentation today know, we focus mainly on expatriates and to some extent migrants and other types of global workers. So for the last 22 years, I've been a labour mobility researcher, and I've spent most of that time focused on the humanity of expatriation, the people, the families that engage in labour mobility and the outcomes of expatriation for them. During that time, I lived as an expatriate myself in expatriate communities all over the world. So I was not only an insider, but I was also doing a form of ethnographic field work that over time actually took its toll on my mental health. The excerpt here is about a 4-year study I did until 2016 about expatriate divorce from Singapore, where I was living at the time, which involved spouses living mostly in Singapore, but also those in the Middle East, other parts of Asia, including China and in Europe. Only 2 articles have ever been published about the expatriate divorce study that I did. Despite that, findings from the study represents an enormous data set running into thousands and thousands of pages. The first article was the findings published here in 2015 in the Journal of Global Mobility. And the second article was published in 2020 about navigating insider status, which I co-authored with a colleague of mine, Heidi Collins, who, like me, is also an insider researcher. So I drew on my experience of the divorce study to highlight key points we wanted to make in that paper about being an insider. And those are the only two papers that have ever been seen about the research I did on expat divorce. But these published articles only scratch the surface in terms of the full set of findings that were there from that study. What isn't reported and published in any detail beyond a descriptive word or two is the cancer diagnoses for several expatriate divorcing wives whose doctors gave them only months to live. There's the homelessness of mothers with children couch surfing in other expats' homes to have somewhere to sleep. Suicide attempts by mothers deported out of the host country by husbands cancelling their visa and geographically and legally separating them from their children, some of whom haven't seen their kids for over a decade. Drug and alcohol-fueled underground sex orgies, pedophile activity, destitution to the point of starving, bankruptcy, criminal conviction under the Hague Convention on International Child Abduction, imprisonment, forced repatriation, sexual assault, domestic violence. So as you can see, when I write here in this published article about infidelity, what I'm not reporting is the lived experience of the participants. Expat husbands spending weekend retreats at luxury apartment-style brothels in Dubai, second wives in Indonesia, and HIV transmission. Sexual misconduct, as I reported here, became the catch-all term I used for pedophile activity reported by the wives of expatriate men, and includes blowjobs for underage female caddies on weekend golf courses, sex orgies in China, and the like. The expat divorce study was based on interviews, which I spent thousands of hours listening to story after story of abuse, trauma, and suffering from over 400 divorcing expat women. And then in 2015, which was the third year of the expat divorce study, this happened. This is Kerrion, a 5-year-old boy living in Singapore with his mum, Gwendolyn, a divorcing expat mother in my study. Her husband murdered their 5-year-old son in 2015 in what she believes was an act intended to end their pre-Hague custody battle. The husband served 5 years imprisonment in Singapore and was then deported to Belgium in 2021, which was where he was originally from. Gwendolyn, a French national, now lives in France, where her son is buried. This study really changed me, not just academically, but personally. Emotionally, it impacted my mental health in ways I didn't foresee or understand, and in ways that I really struggled to cope with at the time. So I subsequently suffered from a condition I'd never heard of called compassion fatigue. It simply means that I ran out of gas. I ran out of empathy and compassion. At that point, I'd been researching expats since 2001, digging deep and going deep, and I subsequently began to actually detest them. I really detested them. Never mind that I was also one of them. Compassion fatigue for me showed up in 2016 in quite an odd way that I really didn't understand at the time. I could no longer look at an expat wife in the same way that I had up until then. I found them quite pathetic. I found myself not empathizing with their plight, but blaming them for the situation that they ended up in. I would sit there doing interviews with them, trying to be this dispassionate observer, which is what we're trained to do when we are interviewing people. But going through my mind, and hopefully I was camouflaging this, was questions like, how could they not see all the steps that were leading to the inevitable outcome of horrific abuse and divorce that they were going to experience? How could they truly sit there and say to me, I never thought it would happen to me, when in my view, it was so obvious that it was going to happen to them. So I began to cringe when I would hear a wife say, he would never do that to me ever. He's just not that cruel. And then he would. And then their pain and that of their children was just so immense. I would sit there trying to be dispassionate, but on the inside, I was thinking to myself, how could they be so stupid for not seeing what was just so obvious to me? I knew at that point, despite all my years of training, that something was wrong for me, that something else was happening and I didn't understand it. So in 2016, I stopped the divorce study. I shut down the data set. And apart from the 2020 article that I published in about insider status, I've not looked at the data set or the study since then, and I actually don't know when or if I will. I've come to understand in the intervening years since 2016 that I am something called a vulnerable researcher. So importantly, I choose to be one. It is something that I actively choose to do as part of my research career. I'm passionate about the type of research and I do, and I know that others are too. What goes on in my own head is something like this. Well, if I don't do this research now, then when will it get done? And if it's not me doing it, then who? So I feel called to do this research. It doesn't mean that I am absolved from finding ways to cope with it. There are apparently thousands of us in this situation. We show up in all the expected fields, such as pediatric oncology, nursing, human rights, policing, sexual assault responders, emergency workers, humanitarian aid, and social justice. And to be really, really clear, the work that we do is incredibly valuable. But we also show up in the sterile fields like management, law, and IT, where people enter these fields probably to ensure emotionally detached involvement from the people that they're studying, but then they unexpectedly encounter things that they didn't expect. And I put myself in this latter category. Some of us know ahead of time that we're likely to be a vulnerable researcher. So if you choose to study people in prisons, like Jane Gilgun explains about the personal toll of her own work doing life history research with men who've been convicted of violent crimes, then you can expect to be immersed in challenging fieldwork. And Jane has published a lot of work about doing qualitative research in fragile contexts. And she's well worth looking up for your own guidance, but try not to get too distracted by some of her earlier work, such as the moral discourse of incest perpetrators. This is a lady who clearly knows her stuff and who wants to be doing what she does. Some of us, though, get thrust into the vulnerable researcher role by accident, actually having no clue it's coming or how we're going to cope with it. Fragile contexts are environments in which one or more extreme events are occurring that exceeds the capacity of those involved and affected to prevent it, resulting in extensive and intolerable outcomes related to physical, psychological, or material consequences. So research undertaken in fragile contexts provides a unique platform to study hard to get at phenomena. Consequently, we shouldn't shy away from it just because it's challenging, because if we do that, it inevitably results in a poorer evidence base for our field. In terms of vulnerable populations, the well-documented examples include juvenile youth offenders and prisoners, refugees, children, pregnant women, mentally incompetent persons, impoverished people, and ethnic minorities. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the vulnerable populations that we study. By its very nature, fieldwork undertaken in these contexts carries a distinct responsibility. not just to the participants the researcher observes and engages with, but also the institution that guides the researcher's entry and the sponsors that fund it. So fieldwork like this is the primary window that uncovers what's going on in people's lives behind the scenes. Accountability for the quality of what is produced from fieldwork is paramount. But there's an added complexity where this type of fieldwork is almost always inductive and iterative by design, meaning it can and needs to be shaped by influences within and outside one's control. The fieldwork undertaken by the vulnerable researcher is therefore a collaboration between the fieldworker and the participants, and the researcher and the institution that supports them being there. That's actually a new way of looking at this, which we haven't seen much of in the IHRM field, but I'll get to that in a minute and explain how we can get or move towards a collaborative relationship with all these stakeholders. Let's be clear about one thing at this point, though. We need more research with vulnerable populations and with other hard-to-reach people. And I would say why I'm so passionate about this topic is that if we don't start doing that type of research, we are at risk of losing our relevance in the international human resource management field. If we don't start digging deeper and going after the tougher, the richer, and the more complex topics, then we are bringing our field into an area where people will start to say, how relevant are we? We need to start looking at the humanity behind the data. Common sense tells us that more goes on behind the scenes of global family life than we can ever imagine, and we need international human resource management researchers that are brave enough and supported enough by their institutions to go out there and start looking behind the front door of these families. Why do we need this research? Well, here's the business case, and the business case is actually pretty simple. Innovative and compelling data leads to better theorising and improved real-world impact. In other words, we're solving real-world problems, which leads to higher quality publications in better journals, which in turn leads to profile building for the individual and their institution, and improved grant attraction for institutions. So the way I see it, the business case is very simple because everybody wins when we do this type of research. To get there, though, and to deliver on the business case, vulnerable researchers need psychological safety, and they need to be supported in the research they do in fragile contexts. What they need is greater confidence to probe for rich data, knowing that their institution has got their back. Right. The way I look at vulnerable researchers and compassion fatigue is through the lens of the ethics review process. So this is where we bring in the institution and what is their role in supporting the vulnerable researcher. Does the ethics review process adequately prepare, monitor, and support researchers to confidently undertake fieldwork in fragile contexts? Does the process support the institutional responsibility to create rigorous knowledge that emerges from the lived experience and the knowing and reflecting on that experience of arduous fieldwork? So what we're bringing together here is the ontics and the epistemology of creating rigorous knowledge. I would argue that the current ethics review support structures are generally insufficient to protect vulnerable researchers' emotional well-being. There is definitely a gap there. Don't get me wrong, though, these processes are excellent at mitigating physical safety risks for participants and researchers. But beyond that, we need to understand to what extent the ethics review process can better support the emotional well-being of vulnerable researchers in terms of their mental, emotional, and psychological health. And I know that for a lot of institutions and universities, that's actually new territory. I position the institution as having an ethical responsibility to co-construct a framework of strategies and interventions with the researcher that ensures a level of individual wellbeing and mental health support, but it must be beyond whatever the researcher is willing to devote to their own self-care. Institutions cannot simply leave it only to the researcher and say that whatever they devote to their own self-care is sufficient and enough. We need to go beyond that. We need researchers that can confidently undertake fieldwork in contexts where compassion fatigue may arise. But by confidence, what I mean is appropriate, institutionally led interventions and strategies that assist the researcher to prepare for, cope with, and build resilience when they're doing this type of research. What I want to explain briefly is the three types of research ethics that directly impacts on and applies to fieldwork in fragile contexts. The question I consider today is, what form should such risk protection take and to whom should it be afforded? How can the ethics review process address risks to the researcher? These ethical issues have been the focus of ongoing debate in attempts to begin extending research protections beyond its conventional structure. But there's actually a silence as to whose responsibility it is to provide it. And that leaves us in a state of affairs at the moment in a lot of institutions where the researcher is left to their own devices to provide their own self-care. And I would argue that that is not going to feed into the business case where everybody wins. So we need to do something different. Let's take a look at procedural ethics. This is run by the Human Research Ethics Committee or the Institutional Review Board, and I'm going to refer to it as the IRB in this presentation. And this is simply a requirement that funding and ethics applications explain the strategies that will prevent and mitigate harm or risks to the research participants. I argue that procedural ethics has become a little bit too regulated, ritualised and sanitized, that it actually unintentionally discourages risky research that can harm the researcher. So what it then does is potentially lowers the quality and negates the value of research output. These overly rigid procedural ethics processes are counterproductive to actually supporting vulnerable researchers and the valuable work that they do. So we need a paradigm shift here that situates the ethics and the ethics review process of research from something that occurs throughout the life of a research project, not just a one-time event that happens before you go out in the field as part of the procedural ethics process, because we know that that process happens before you go out. You get the tick in the box, you get the approval, and then you go out into the field and you may never actually have contact with the IRB again unless you instigate it. We need to change that when you're doing research in fragile contexts for vulnerable researchers. Procedural ethics is actually rarely open to any kind of deep level of ongoing risk assessment, and that's what we need to change. There's an urgent need to critically review the legitimacy and power that's given to the IRB. That applies something akin to universal rules when making decisions about the veracity of ethical research design. So what's really important here is attention to and probing about the specifics of in-field and post-field ethical dilemmas that more fully appreciates the situated nature of fieldwork in fragile contexts. Ethics in practice is another way to look at how we can improve the ethics review process. And this is concerned with day-to-day ethical dilemmas that arise in the course of doing research and how they are addressed. So here's a classic situation. A classic situation of an ethical dilemma could be whether you breach confidentiality if a respondent discloses to you that they wish to physically harm another individual or themselves, or if they confess to a crime or knowledge of a crime for which someone else has been arrested or imprisoned. And this actually occurred for me when I was doing the divorce study, but it's something at this point that I'm not at liberty to discuss publicly or talk about any further. While such disclosures place a responsibility on the researcher to consider a course of action at some later point, like after the interview's over or the fieldwork is done, what are you going to do about the information that you've received? The more pressing ethical issue is, how do you respond to that at that particular point in time when you're in the field? Who is supporting you about what decision you're going to make? Do you move on and pretend that what they've said or revealed to you is of no moral consequence and you just ignore the gravity of the information that they've conveyed to you? Should the tape recorder be turned off, or should you surreptitiously turn it on? Should the interview guide be abandoned in favour of eliciting as much helpful information as possible so that you can use it later? When participants are in states of distress or at risk of further harm, should the researcher stop the interview and offer practical help to get the respondent to a safer location? What would you do in these ethically important moments? In my own case, when I was doing the divorce study, I can share that one homeless mother with 5 children revealed during the interview that we were doing at the courthouse in Singapore that her children had not eaten a proper meal for 3 days. So I stopped the interview. I drove them all to my house. I fed them lunch, snacks and dinner at my house while they spent the afternoon swimming in our pool. My own children thought they were just another expat family that had come by for a play date, and they happily joined in. Meanwhile, I continued the interview informally in the living room of my house during the course of the afternoon as the mother relaxed and opened up about her horrific experience with the Hague Convention on International Child Abduction. So all of these examples represent some of the ethical dilemmas that a vulnerable researcher is going to experience during field work. Being mindful that while no course of action that's taken by the researcher is entirely right or wrong, whatever decision is made is likely to be fraught with potentially unintended consequences. So what I can say, and I've experienced it myself, and I've read about this with others that are engaged in this type of research, is that we're often repeatedly exposed to ethically important moments, like the examples I've given above, which are rarely addressed in procedural ethics. But to be really fair, it can't be addressed at that point in the ethics review process, given that these kinds of moments are impossible to predict when you're doing field work. Still, procedural ethics is about all we have in a lot of institutions. So the ethics support actually stops before the study has even commenced. And that's what we want to try and address here for those that are doing this type of research and experience compassion fatigue. Ethical dilemmas can result in something that I now know is moral distress for a researcher. It's an emotional response that arises from being unable to pursue or carry out the right course of action to alleviate others' suffering. So in the example I gave when I was interviewing the mother of 5, the homeless mother with her children, I was faced with, what is the right thing to do here? How do I alleviate their suffering? Is that my role? Is that my job? I made a decision that I did that afternoon. I don't know whether it made a difference, but I felt in moral distress, and I felt it was the right thing to do. Moral distress manifests as a practice-oriented dilemma. Researchers might, for example, feel compelled to deeply reflect upon their decision to enter the field when they're struggling to understand the magnitude of the trauma and cruelty that they're actually seeing and the limits as to what can be achieved from their work. The other challenge is that you've got to try not to take sides, and I found that very, very difficult when I was doing the divorce study. Okay. We need to stay here just for one more moment, okay, to more fully consider the ethics surrounding the emotional component of fieldwork in fragile contexts. So when vulnerable researchers respond emotionally to the work they do, it arises from their reaction to something that we call moral violations. Emotions like anger, disgust, or contempt or from their motivation to engage in moral behaviour by documenting and publishing trauma, injustice and abuse. It's the interplay of these emotions that situates the researcher's fieldwork journey within the ethics of moral emotions, which is actually a term and a concept. So the central issue here is to challenge conventional ethics review processes that are predominantly rooted in the positive paradigm where researcher detachment, impartiality and objectivity are privileged and rewarded over post-positive perspectives that advocates for unstable, situated and subjective ways of knowing. So we've got two different types of ways that we actually generate knowledge. In the case of the vulnerable researcher, there's a need to challenge the myth of objectivity and the long-standing emphasis on rationality and instead shift towards an epistemological bracing of researcher emotions, subjectivities and biases. And all of those can also positively impact on what knowledge gets produced and how. What we have in our field and lots of other fields is this tension between the two paradigms. While conventional research deems the self as being an insignificant observer and an unwelcome influence in the production of reliable and unbiased knowledge, post-positive paradigms actually invite a level of critical reflection on one's positionality as a means of accounting for the influence of the self in the research. That means how subjectivities influence the topic and methods, what one observes and doesn't observe, and how data are interpreted and analysed. It's not possible, and I strongly believe it's not ethical when working in fragile contexts to deny one's emotions, as emotional positioning by its nature produces more honest and ethical research. But the emotional component of fieldwork is rarely flagged or addressed in procedural ethics occurring before you go out into the field, other than to say that insufficient emotional distance is likely to result in unscientific findings and biased findings. And I've had that as well. And that's been said to me by countless reviewers, by countless editors of journals, that how do we know that you're not too close to this data and there's bias in the findings and the way that they've been analysed? But if we uncritically deny the emotional nature of fieldwork by emphasising a correspondingly false expectation of objectivity, well, why are we there? Unfortunately, I think in the IHRM field that it remains heavily dominated by the traditions of positivism, that encourages researchers not to feel but to think, not to feel but to think, on the basis that personal perspectives are theoretically unpopular and subject to suspicion and scepticism by much of the academic research community. This includes reviewers and editors that publish our work. It probably also includes some supervisors of doctoral research and other faculty who may deem our work unprofessional if we have a level of subjectivity to what we do. Okay. Let me get to the next part here, and this is the deliverable from this presentation. What can you do? How can you work with supervisors, other faculty, and your IRB to actually bring this subjectivity and this emotional component of the work that we do into the ethics review process? I adopt as a starting point for this a realist approach that vulnerable researchers actually love the work that they do. Right? They're very passionate about it. It's part of who they are. But compassion fatigue is going to become an inevitable part of doing that kind of research. So we need to address the complexities of research in fragile contexts, and we need to see it as being complementary and central to the practices and interventions for trauma-informed research. So researchers that intentionally position themselves as vulnerable, they need not be shunned or dismissed as individuals in breach of conventional ethics guidelines. Instead, we need to look at them as adding significant value to the field by deepening collective understanding of phenomena and bringing new insight to established thinking. If a key part of the IRB ethics review process is concerned with the integrity of inquiry in terms of what is right and just, research ethics must also include protecting and supporting vulnerable researchers' psychological well-being. So how might we begin to address this shortcoming via the ethics review process? There are 4 layers of scaffolding that I propose: who, when, what, and how. And I'm going to talk about those now to deliver for you the framework of how we might do this. So the first layer of scaffolding identifies 3 stakeholders: the vulnerable researcher, if you're a doctoral student, the supervisor, if you're not a doctoral student but you're working in a team, whoever the principal investigator is, the PI, and the IRB, which is representative of the institution. The vulnerable researcher is doing the field work, the supervisor or PI is supporting the vulnerable researcher, and the IRB is providing the ethical oversight. So each stakeholder has primary responsibility, among others, for individually and collectively preparing the vulnerable researcher to enter fieldwork and continually monitoring and supporting them throughout the life of the research project for the emotional and ethical challenges that they're undertaking. That's why the vulnerable researcher is positioned here in the middle, with the other 2 stakeholders positioned around them. So the flow of information between these stakeholders is depicted on this slide. The role of the supervisor PI is actually really important. For practical reasons, this person is going to act on behalf of the vulnerable researcher during the fieldwork stage to feed back important information to the IRB for discussion and resolution. Prior studies actually show that vulnerable researchers are usually unable to perform this function for themselves in a timely and effective way, given their deep immersion in the field and what they are facing. The supervisor PI performs 2 important functions. They liaise and discuss with the vulnerable researcher their ethical concerns, struggles, challenges, and requests. And then they act as the liaison between the researcher and the IRB to give voice to these matters. So what the supervisor or PI is actually doing is liaising with the IRB in the absence of the researcher who's doing the field work and is out in the field, asking the questions, seeking the support, and then feeding that back to the vulnerable researcher. So what we've got here is a layer of scaffolding that can emotionally support the vulnerable researcher to do what they do. The involvement, though, of the supervisor PI during the preparation stage, so this is in the procedural ethics stage, they need to be involved there as well so that they've got a good understanding of the project before fieldwork commences. And they also have involvement after exiting fieldwork. And what that does is ensure that there's co-learning going on between the IRB, the researcher, and the PI, where we've got learning opportunities for everybody post-field work from the experience of a vulnerable researcher being out in the field. And that's something that I'm not sure goes on in a lot of institutions post-field work. What do we learn from this? How can we do better? How can we improve this for vulnerable researchers and for others? The IRB is positioned here in the framework as a 3rd key stakeholder because of the committee's central role in ethics oversight of institutional research projects. The 3rd layer of scaffolding encompasses 4 dimensions of ethical thinking. And this helps each of the key stakeholders to enact their roles and their responsibilities. So each ethical dimension offers an alternative yet complementary lens through which to identify, explore, discuss, problem solve, and learn about ethical dilemmas. And we see them here in this slide. So how do we use this and these ethical dimensions in a framework for vulnerable researchers? Well, this is part of the framework. This is consequential ethics. So this is what it looks like in practice. Here I'm using the first ethical dimension, consequential ethics, to make critical thinking explicit and visible through what I call carefully planned collaborative and international talk. What we have here is a series of questions that opens up a dialogue between the three key stakeholders: the vulnerable researcher, the supervisor PI, and the IRB. So this is an example of key areas for discussion before, during, and after field work for a guided dialogue. This is actually quite a contemporary approach to research ethics. It's actually, I believe, a useful tool for creating ethical awareness, but also transparent ethical reasoning, so that we can have conversations at an ethics level before, during, and after field work. What would we do in this type of scenario? What did you do? What did we learn from that? So reflexive analysis, and that's what this is based on. It's a reflexive dialogic practice. Requires the vulnerable researcher to be explicit and to acknowledge and critically analyse the various ways in which their positionality, their lived experience, their understandings, their beliefs, their social positioning related to gender and race, and their moral values enter into the research process, and which then impacts on the production of knowledge, but not as a problem or a shortcoming. None of this is positioned as being an issue that needs to be resolved, rather as something that could actually be useful and which produces more rigorous knowledge. Reflexivity enhances accountability for the various ways in which you, as the researcher, shows up in the fieldwork that you do and in the outcomes that you produce. And it's fundamental to achieving research integrity and data trustworthiness. But it's actually a lot more than that. Reflexivity embodies ethics in practice, before, during, after, because it gives voice to researchers' emotional experiences. And that's not something that I think we touch on a lot at the institutional level in the ethics review process thus far. It allows the researcher to explore how they may have handled emotionally charged experiences in better ways, as well as to name their own difficult reactions to what they've witnessed and been told by others. And I can attest to that for myself. I didn't have this reflexive opportunity to talk about the experiences I was having during the divorce study, but I would have loved it to be able to debrief and get those things off my chest and to learn from it. How could I have handled that better? What didn't I think of at the time? A dialogic approach, which we're seeing here, is useful for the IRB ethics review process because it encourages an openness towards knowledge exchange among experienced and also novice researchers to engage reflexively with research practices. So it's also positioned here as a really important conceptual tool for developing ethical vigilance and intellectual agility that enhances how ethics in practice can be achieved. But I want to raise something here that a lot of you are probably thinking. If you're a vulnerable researcher already, or if you want to become one, and you want to approach your institution for support, how do you overcome resistance to helping you achieve that goal? And there will be resistance. How do you convince an IRB that emotional support is critical to your success? How do you convince an IRB that emotional support is critical to your success? Well, I'm sorry, but I don't have the answer for that. I wish I did, but I don't. What I can tell you is that if you experience resistance to this kind of approach to ethics, you're not actually alone. This is a really vastly under-researched topic with a really scattered body of literature across several disconnected disciplines that basically don't talk to each other. Even in fields where you would expect emotional support for vulnerable researchers to be in some sort of advanced stage of development or even be fully practiced, there is unfortunately nothing there either. And I speak from experience on this. Data upon which this presentation is based stems from my master's thesis in human rights, which I completed last year in 2022 at the University of London. And I did that thesis on the topic of compassion fatigue for vulnerable researchers. And I took a human rights lens. How do we support human rights field workers? It would be entirely appropriate for you to expect the human rights field to have this stuff nailed, right? Just look at what they're exposed to in terms of documenting survivors' horrific abuse, which I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. Think about their day-to-day work of advocating for human rights, in which their emotions rise and fall daily with a mix of hope and despair. And this is a normal part of their work. But even there in that field, institutional support for researchers' emotional well-being is sorely lacking, not just in universities where researchers exist, but also in NGOs such as Amnesty International. There is simply nothing in place that supports vulnerable researchers to do the job that they do. There's lots of reasons why that's so, and much of it stems from the nature of actually working with vulnerable populations, where the culture of the institution or the NGO that's funding and supporting the work that you're doing compels you to deny your own needs in light of the gravity of the respondents' fragility and suffering. So there's a tendency to view an emotional response to challenging fieldwork as a first world problem. Our ethical struggles are deemed as unimportant and unjustifiable, as self-indulgent. And so we deny looking at them and we forego self-care. But there's also something else that happens. Sometimes it's the researcher themselves that self-sabotages their own well-being when it comes to doing this type of research. There might be a fear of failure, of revealing they're not coping, and then being at the mercy of powerful stakeholders who have the power and authority to reduce funding or not renew their scholarship, which is a frightening scenario that most researchers want to avoid. So they stay silent. They manage in the field as best they can. They cover up mistakes. They swallow emotions or drink them away or eat them away, or they cope in unhealthy ways with what they're seeing, but they never reveal. To overcome resistance to getting the emotional support they would need, consider where the resistance is coming from. So what I would say to you is, if you are at your institution trying to get support for this, dig deep and ask yourself, where is the resistance coming from? Is it coming from me, or is it coming from the institutional culture? If it's the institution, who can you find at the institution that can champion your cause to at least have a conversation, for example, about an ethics in practice approach? If it's self-sabotage, and this is something that you don't feel comfortable revealing that you're struggling, can you start a conversation with somebody important, a champion at your institution, and perhaps open up about some of your own challenging fieldwork experiences and mistakes? Let me tell you, though, that opening up about this stuff, if that's something that I'm recommending you do and you want to do, in 22 years of talking about and researching this type of work that I've done at conferences, this is the first time in this presentation that I have revealed some of these deeper challenges and ethical challenges that I myself have faced. It took me 22 years to actually open up about it here. So I recognize that this is not easy to do, to be transparent and say, I don't know if I handled this correctly or in the right way. Don't be too hard on yourself. Find that person that you can speak to and open up to. And I started to do that only when I found that person, and that person knows who they are, where I could talk to about this stuff. Let's not despair, though. All is not lost in the international HRM field. The point of this presentation, as I said at the start, was to get a conversation going about doing challenging research, and there is hope on the horizon for us in this field. There has been some recent activity. Here are 3 examples. The first one's by Kate Hutchings and Snezhina Mikalova, and they looked at doctoral research when it does not follow ethical practice. And there is potential for damaged relations between organisations and universities, which can impact student, supervisor and university reputations. This paper on the left-hand side was actually published in 2022, and it really digs deep into procedural ethics. The authors reflect on their experiences as supervisors, and they offer insights and action guidelines. So this is a paper that is actually really well worth reading. The second one in the middle is by Oliver Wirtz about expatriation, alcohol and drugs, and was actually one of the first to be so explicit about substance abuse, and they actually put it in the title. This was published in 2018. This is based on a large study of 205 expatriates and 96 expat supervisor dyads. The study actually describes some of the outcomes of drug and alcohol use for these individuals. And then the third one is a study done by McNulty and authors published in 2019 looking at expats in crisis. What they found in terms of outcomes from the study was 41 expatriates in Singapore were arrested, imprisoned and caned, but these were highly educated, affluent and very senior expatriate managers with families. Once they completed their prison term, they were actually deported to their home country. The sentences that these high-status expats were given ranged from 2 weeks to 9 months. So there is hope for us as a field. We do have this research beginning to emerge where vulnerable researchers are coming out into the open. Now what we need to do is think at the institutional level about how we can support them, better support them to do more of this research. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. It's actually been my pleasure to be here this morning with you, and I really thank you for joining me. There are two ways that you can cite the work that's presented here, either the under review manuscript at the Journal of Human Rights, which is taken from this presentation, or you can cite the master's thesis completed at the University of London. So both copies contain full references for the work presented here. While I haven't included citations in this presentation so that I could keep it quite clean, you can be assured, and you can, that this work is fully and extensively referenced in both the manuscript and the thesis. So lastly, this is me, and really the only important information here is my email address. Please contact me for a copy of either the under review manuscript or the thesis. So back to you, Mila.
Thank you so very much, Yvonne, for this very thought-provoking presentation. So I started taking notes and I filled a few pages. So this is super dense. And I'm sure it was the same for everybody that attended. Now, a reminder to everybody, we have recorded this. Maybe this is something I should have warned people. So I did not explicitly warn you. So if anyone has any concerns about that, please contact us as soon as possible. But we do post these and we will post yours. And I'm sure this will definitely be subject to repeated viewing because there's a lot there. Even if it's something that, at least on the surface, we do not encounter usually. We have actually hit time, but I would allow myself a couple of questions because I'm sure we can continue the conversation for many hours on end, particularly because it's something that many of us haven't really thought about, and your presentation is making me ask myself a lot of questions. Now, being a little bit provocative, thinking about IRBs in particular, how would an IRB know to what study would involve vulnerability? Vulnerability of the researcher in particular. I think IRB boards tend to be quite concerned about any damage that may occur to the subjects, and they're less concerned about the researchers. And I must say, if a colleague that is in IRB board is looking at that and saying, Mila, what are you talking about? I do speak just as a layperson, not as somebody that does not research on that. So sort of at what point IRB involvement becomes too much for studies that may perhaps not involve vulnerability? Like, what's the thin red line? You know what I mean? Like, how would they know where to apply pressure? Pressure. That's not even the right way of asking the question. You see how foreign that language is to me, but how do they know to step in? Because they definitely have a role to play, as you have laid a very solid argument, but in what circumstances?
It comes down to transparency. So if you've got a student being supervised, it would be up to the supervisor to actually be transparent in the ethics application that this person is considered a vulnerable researcher, and then the context for that, or in what way. So it may require an additional question. It may require an additional tick the box somewhere on the ethics form where that researcher or the PI or whatever. And so there would need to be a discussion around, well, what would be the criteria for somebody who is a vulnerable researcher? And one of the slides actually talks about what is research in fragile context, what does it look like, what does the researcher, vulnerable researcher look like? That kind of question that's posed. What you're relying on, though, is honesty. They're relying on honesty from the researcher and from the supervisor. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be this conversation of them not being afraid to reveal that they're a vulnerable researcher, because that's then going to open them up to more support. So it will help them rather than be a negative for them. So it's something cultural that needs to happen.
Right. I mean, and that's a follow-up question here. Like, what would prevent people from identifying themselves as vulnerable researchers? Would it be lack of awareness or fear of stigma or some other negative consequence?
Fear. It's the same thing that plagued me for 20 years. I never wanted to reveal this because I never wanted to show that I didn't know how to cope with it. I think there's this just implicit assumption that if you choose to do this work, then you've done your own training, right? Yeah. That's in some way I have done that, and I haven't. And also some of the things that were uncovered for me were beyond anything I couldn't have imagined that I would find. I didn't think that those findings were possible. I was shocked. Yeah. And what do you do once you know it, right? So it's fear. It comes down to, in my view, personal view, it comes down to the culture of the institution. So pastoral care. We are very interested in you as a human being, not just the research that you do. We look at the whole person, and we want to support you in this, because that hard to reach stuff is gold. It is so great to publish on that stuff. It's a relationship between all of the stakeholders. So there is no easy solution here, but part of it, I think, is having a conversation like we're doing now. We're bringing it out into the open and say, hello, we exist, we are here, and we could really do with some support. And it really only takes one person on an IRB or a supervisor or in a faculty to champion and say, hey, I think we need to do something here. And that person can champion it. I actually think it's really hard for vulnerable researchers themselves to champion it. They need somebody in this institution who's actually buys into it and actually understands it. So, for example, if I'm working on the faculty, I'd put my hand up to be that person. Mm-hmm. I'd put my hand up to say, I'll champion this. I'll talk to whoever we think is a vulnerable researcher. I'll have the conversation with them and be that champion, because there's less of a power differential for somebody like me than there would be for a student, right?
Right. No, but I think the awareness is really important, because I think highlighting that these sort of issues can be prevalent even in the research of people that we traditionally consider to be quite privileged. And, we discuss, the worst thing you would discuss is, oh, somebody's not adjusted, whereas beneath the surface, there's far more happening. So I think, and of course, I think what you're talking about, if you think about a business school, anybody looking at maybe underprivileged workers or immigrant workers, I mean, there's a very vast field where that can be, that all of what you said can be very, very applicable. Now, we're now past minutes 5 time. I'm very privileged to have access to you. So I think you and I will continue that conversation. But for everybody still listening, Yvonne was very kind to share her email. And I'm sure, as you said, Yvonne, they can reach out to you if they have additional questions. We will post this presentation. Encourage your friends, your colleagues, your students, your IRB board, your deans, to have a look, to watch it, and that can hopefully be the beginning of a very meaningful conversation that doesn't end with this presentation, but it really begins with that presentation. So that's my hope, Yvonne, after that hour with you. So thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart and from everybody involved in the webinar series for that. So I need to momentarily put my advertiser hat on just to mention a few things that may be of interest to people that are still here, as we're sort of part of this IHRM community. There's a couple of interesting conferences that maybe that I want to put on your radar, and Kara is helping me putting those in the chat. There's the HR International Conference that will take place in South Africa, and the deadline has not yet passed, so you can still submit to that. There's also a conference that will be held in London in June, which is the International HRM Conference, which is to follow up a conference that never happened in Paris, which really inspired this entire series of webinars. And last but not least, there is an ongoing call for papers for a journal of World Business, which is on the future of global work and what's next for international HRM. Perhaps there's a paper on vulnerable populations, vulnerable workers in IHRM. We would love to see that. So please have a look at that as well. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. We have another webinar on February 23rd, where Professor Wolfgang Mehrhofer from Wirtschaftsuniversität in Vienna will be talking to us about the role of time, and we hope to see you then. And with that, good night for me, good afternoon, or good rest of your day for the rest of you. Thanks again. Goodbye.